2 days after my grandmother Eleanor's memorial. My mother stood between me and a conference room door as if she had been waiting for the chance. "Hannah, this meeting concerns Whitmore," Patricia Bennett said, one hand on the brass handle. "You can wait outside." Through the narrow opening behind her, I could see my father seated. David was looking down at a yellow legal pad. My brother Cole sat next to him, relaxed enough to lean back in his chair. Nathan Brooks, Grandma's estate attorney, was at the far end with two people I didn't recognize. Nobody looked surprised that Mom had stopped me. That hurt more than the words. For a second, I considered asking why I had been invited if I wasn't supposed to enter, but I knew how those conversations ended. Mom would explain, Cole would smirk, Dad would say nothing. Somehow I would become difficult for noticing I had been excluded. So I used the sentence that had carried me through most of my life. "It's fine." I turned toward the elevators. "No." Nathan's voice wasn't loud, but everybody stopped. I looked back. He had risen from his chair. "She stays." Mom's hand slipped from the door handle. "Nathan, she doesn't work for the company." "This is not a management meeting," he said. "And Eleanor instructed me not to begin without Hannah." Cole's smile faded. I stayed where I was for another second, unsure whether stepping into the room would feel like winning or trespassing. Nathan pulled out the empty chair across from him. "Please." Mom moved aside. I walked in. Nathan waited until the door was closed before speaking again. "This is an estate and trust governance conference. Eleanor's will has already been submitted for probate. Today's discussion concerns her revocable trust, the voting interests associated with Whitmore exhibit and fabrication. Several governance instructions she executed before her death, and one memorandum she directed me to keep sealed until the required family members were present." Cole laughed. Grandma loved making an entrance. Nathan didn't respond. He removed a cream-colored envelope from a red folder. My name was written on the front in Grandma's handwriting. Along with Mom's, Dad's, and Cole's, he broke the seal. The first line changed the room. "If Patricia has attempted to exclude Hannah from this meeting, then one of the concerns that led me to prepare these instructions has already been confirmed." Mom went still. Dad looked away from me. Cole stopped smiling. And I was 12 years old again, standing in the kitchen while Mom told me Cole needed her more. Then 22. Walking out of my college graduation while my parents hurried toward me 40 minutes late. Cole had an important event that morning. Mom explained. "You understand, don't you?" I smiled because she looked relieved when I did. "It's fine." Another memory followed. Thanksgiving, 3 years later. Cole brought a girlfriend home without warning. Mom moved my place card from beside Grandma to the narrow end of the table. "You don't mind, do you? We want Emily to feel included." "Of course not." I ate that year with one elbow nearly touching the wall. At the time, neither moment had seemed large enough to fight about. That was the genius of favoritism in our family. It rarely arrived as cruelty. It arrived as a small request to be reasonable, followed by another, until one person was always being asked to make room. Nathan continued reading. Eleanor wrote that for years she had watched our family confuse independence with invulnerability. Because I needed less rescuing than Cole. Everyone had gradually behaved as though I needed less consideration. I stared at the page in Nathan's hands. Nobody had ever described it that clearly. Mom finally spoke. "This is unnecessary." Nathan looked at her. "We haven't reached the necessary part yet." He set Grandma's letter aside and pulled a thick gray folder from his briefcase. The folder landed on the table with enough weight to make Cole sit forward. Nathan rested one hand on it. Several months before her death, Eleanor retained an independent forensic accounting firm. Dad's face changed. Mom's eyes moved immediately to the folder. Cole said nothing. Nathan looked around the table. Your grandmother was not only preparing her estate. He opened the file. She was investigating the company. Whitmore Exhibit and Fabrication existed long before anyone in my family started arguing about what it meant to belong there. My grandmother, Eleanor Whitmore, founded the company nearly 40 years earlier in a rented warehouse with 3 employees, a second-hand panel saw, and more stubbornness than money. She designed trade show displays at night, negotiated freight in the mornings, and sometimes drove finished pieces herself when a shipment missed its window. By the time I was old enough to understand what Whitmore did, the company had grown to around 60 employees. It built trade show environments, museum installations, corporate exhibits, and custom display systems that traveled across the Midwest. Grandma still served as board chair. A few years before she died, she had pushed the company to become less dependent on family habits and more dependent on formal governance. She added outside directors, tightened board procedures, and insisted that decisions be reviewed by people who did not share our last name. Mom hated some of that. Grandma called it growing up. Inside the company, the family roles looked simple. My mother, Patricia, was CFO. My father, David, was controller. Cole was vice president of business development. I worked somewhere else entirely. I was a compliance coordinator for a medical device manufacturer. My days involved supplier documentation, inspection records, corrective actions, deviation reports, and release approvals if a batch failed review. I helped make sure nobody signed it through just because a deadline was inconvenient. Cole called me Clipboard Hannah. Mom described my job as paperwork. Grandma never did. She once told me, organizations rarely collapse because nobody saw the big problem. They collapse because people kept ignoring the small inconsistencies that warned them first. That was one of the times I felt someone in my family understood why my work mattered. Cole's life had always required more intervention than mine. He changed colleges once, left another program early, carried credit card debt, bounced through jobs before joining Whitmore, and had a habit of creating emergencies that somehow became family projects. Mom responded the way she always did. She helped, then helped again, then explained why he needed more help than everyone else. I was different. I got decent grades, paid my bills, kept jobs, showed up when I said I would. I rarely asked for money and never called home with a crisis. Whenever I noticed the difference in how we were treated, Mom gave me the same answer. Cole needs more support. You've always been able to handle yourself. For years, I heard that as praise. Later, I understood the hidden cost. My strength had slowly become permission to neglect me, because I could handle disappointment. People assumed disappointment did not hurt, because I did not ask to be rescued. Nobody asked whether I was tired of rescuing myself. About 14 months before Grandma died, she started inviting me to her house on Sunday afternoons. Sometimes we talked, sometimes she put paperwork between us, vendor reports, expense descriptions, freight costs, supplier numbers. She never told me what she suspected. She only asked questions. If shipping volume drops but freight costs rise, what would you want to see? The shipment level detail? If 2 vendors have different names but the same address? I'd check ownership. If expense descriptions keep repeating, I'd ask who wrote them and what documentation supports them. Grandma would nod, make a note, and move on. One Sunday, I finally asked, Why didn't you ever say anything about Mom and Cole? She looked at me for a long time. I told myself they were Patricia's children. Then she added, I told myself it wasn't my place. Did you believe that? At the time, yes. She folded her hands. Now, I think I was using respectable language to avoid confrontation. That answer stayed with me because Grandma did not excuse herself. She understood something I was only beginning to learn. Good people can help unfair systems survive by deciding silence is more civilized than conflict. A few weeks later, she slid one report across the kitchen table. At the top was a vendor name I recognized from nothing else we had reviewed, Hawthorne Strategic Events. I scanned several invoices. The descriptions were different, but not really. Same phrases, same sequence, same vague claims about client development. Grandma watched me. What would you do? Ask for supporting documentation. She nodded once. So did I. Nathan left the forensic folder open on the table, but he did not start by accusing anyone. Eleanor was careful about that, he said. She did not want suspicion turned into a verdict. He summarized the concerns she had documented before hiring outside reviewers. Hawthorne Strategic Events had become a favored vendor after Cole recommended it. Competitive bid requirements had been bypassed more than once. Client development reimbursements had risen sharply. Several vendor files were incomplete. A number of questionable approvals carried Dad's credentials, and an accounts payable supervisor who had raised questions about Hawthorne had later been reassigned. Cole shifted in his chair. So, Grandma decided that meant fraud? No, Nathan said. She specifically instructed the reviewers not to assume that. He read from Eleanor's memorandum. The review was meant to determine whether the problems reflected sloppy management, undisclosed conflicts of interest, negligence, personal enrichment, or some combination of those things. That distinction mattered to me. Grandma had been suspicious, but she had not written the ending before the evidence arrived. Mom folded her arms. And she hired accountants without telling finance? Yes, I was CFO. You were also one of the people whose decisions were being reviewed. Mom's expression hardened. Nathan continued. As controlling shareholder and board chair, Eleanor had authority to retain independent advisors. She believed advance notice could compromise the review, so the engagement was handled through separate counsel and the independent directors. For the first time, the outside directors in the room made sense. Grandma had not created an investigation from nowhere. She had spent years building enough governance around the company that the family could not simply vote itself innocent. Nathan closed the forensic folder and opened another binder. This brings us to ownership. Cole leaned forward. Mom became still again. At the time of her death, Grandma controlled 59% of Whitmore's voting shares. 3 months earlier, she had transferred 52% of those voting shares into the Whitmore Governance Trust. Nathan looked at me. Hannah is the successor voting trustee for the initial 12-month review period. I stared at him. Cole laughed. She doesn't even work here. That is part of the point, Nathan said. Mom turned toward me. You cannot seriously be considering this. I'm not considering anything, I said. I just found out. Nathan raised one hand. Let me be precise. Hannah has not been appointed CEO. She does not control daily operations. She cannot write herself checks, sell the company for personal benefit, or fire Patricia or Cole because she is angry, Cole frowned. What can she do? She can exercise the vote attached to the trust shares on governance matters. Subject to fiduciary duties, she can protect the independent board. She can prevent interested family members from replacing directors merely to stop the investigation. Most importantly, she can keep the review alive long enough for the records to be examined. He looked at Cole. Eleanor did not choose Hannah because she believed Hannah understood Whitmore better than everyone here. She chose her because Hannah was outside your chain of command. Nobody spoke. For most of my life, being outside had meant being less important. Now distance was what made me useful. Nathan slid a photocopy toward me. Beneath Grandma's signature was a handwritten note. Hannah, you are allowed to be angry, but anger is not an accounting method. Do not use this authority to punish them. Use it to make hiding impossible. I read those lines twice. They removed something from the moment I had not admitted was there. Satisfaction. A small part of me had enjoyed watching Cole lose his smile and Mom lose control of the room. Grandma had anticipated that too. She had not given me permission to win an old family argument. She had given me a responsibility to protect a process. Mom recovered first. We need to handle this as a family. I looked at her. 10 minutes earlier, family had been the reason I belonged in the hallway. Was I family at the door? Dad closed his eyes. Mom said nothing. Nathan checked his calendar. A special board meeting will be held 14 days from today. Until then, a legal hold is effective immediately. Relevant records are to be preserved, and no material under review is to be deleted, altered, or removed. He closed the binder. The room had not decided who was guilty. It had decided something more dangerous to people who depended on silence. Nobody was allowed to make the questions disappear. When I got home 2 nights after the trust meeting, my mother was standing in my kitchen. For one strange second, I thought I had walked into the wrong apartment. Then I saw Patricia's coat draped over one of my chairs and a leather folder sitting beside the sink. Mom? She turned as if she had every right to be there. You're home early. I looked toward the front door. How did you get in? The emergency key. 3 years earlier, I had given my parents a spare after a pipe burst while I was out of town. You used the emergency key? Her expression tightened. I'm your mother. The answer was so familiar that I almost missed what it meant. At Nathan's office, she had believed she could decide whether I entered a room. Now she had decided she could enter mine. Patricia tapped the folder. I came because there's still time to fix this. Inside was a proposed agreement. If I resigned as voting trustee and supported the appointment of a replacement acceptable to the family, my parents would pay me $175,000 after probate closed. Mom would also transfer a small portion of her future non-voting economic interest in Whitmore, subject to the company's restrictions. I read the first page twice. You're offering to pay me to undo Grandma's decision. I'm trying to protect the company. From what? Instability. Her voice softened. 60 people depend on Whitmore. Clients hate uncertainty. Employees hear rumors. Vendors get nervous. Your grandmother was angry. Hannah. She made decisions while she was angry. The uncomfortable part was that some of what Mom said was true. Investigations could frighten clients. Management changes could disrupt work. 60 paychecks were attached to decisions being made by people who had never expected me to have a vote. But fear did not make the records disappear. Mom watched me carefully. You're good at details. I've always said that. She had not, but I let it pass. That's not the same as leadership. Cole understands relationships. He knows which clients need reassurance and which ones need space. You don't know this business. My first instinct was immediate. I wanted to explain my job. Regulated manufacturing, supplier risk, corrective actions, audits, decisions where missing documentation could stop an entire release. I could have spent 20 minutes proving that my work required judgment. Then I realized I was doing exactly what I had always done, trying to earn the right to be taken seriously, so I closed the folder. Then the review should prove you right. Mom stared at me. You really believe you're ready for this? I believe I don't have to stop it. Her mouth tightened. She picked up the folder and headed for the door. You've changed. No, I said. I'm just not explaining my no until you approve it. After she left, I found the spare key on the counter. The next morning, I called building management. They canceled the emergency access and changed my door code. Then I texted both my parents. Emergency access has been removed. Please call before coming over, Dad replied. Understood. Mom did not. For the first time, I understood that boundaries were not speeches designed to make other people agree with me. They were decisions I could make even while someone disapproved. Changing a lock did not make me cruel. It simply made permission visible again. At work, my supervisor Rachel stopped beside my desk that afternoon. You look exhausted. Do you need Friday off? I can manage. That's not what I asked. I looked at her. No lecture, no accusation, just a question. For years, I had treated needing nothing as evidence that I deserved respect. Actually, I said. Yes, Friday would help, Rachel nodded. Put it in the system. The following morning, one of Grandma's forensic accountants called. Hannah, has anyone asked you to delete, revise, move, or destroy company records since the legal hold began? No. Has anyone asked you to make an exception? No. Why? There was a pause. Someone attempted to access an archived vendor folder yesterday after permissions on that folder had been restricted. My hand tightened around the phone. Who? We're still determining that. The call ended a minute later. I stared at my screen. The board meeting was still days away. Someone was already testing the locks. The governance meeting took place in Whitmore's training room, not Grandma's house, and that changed the atmosphere immediately. There were no family photographs on the walls, no familiar dining table, no seating arrangement Patricia could quietly control. Only fluorescent lights, legal pads, bottled water, and a projector waiting at the front of the room. 3 independent directors attended, along with Nathan, separate counsel, 2 forensic accountants, Patricia, David, Cole, and me. For once, nobody was there as my mother, my father, or my brother. They were officers, directors, employees, and people whose decisions had left records. The room felt less like a family confrontation than an inspection bay at my job. Every claim had to survive a document, a timestamp, or a policy. For someone like me, that was comforting. Facts did not care who usually sat at the head of the table. The lead accountant began with Hawthorne Strategic Events. Over 21 months, Whitmore had received 43 invoices from Hawthorne. 17 contained descriptions that were different in wording, but almost identical in structure. Several travel charges did not match Whitmore's event calendar. One invoice billed $21,400 for a client reception in Nashville. The named client had confirmed that no such reception had taken place. Cole leaned forward. Hawthorne did confidential prospecting. Clients don't necessarily know every event or meeting connected to business development. The accountant nodded. That is possible. Cole glanced toward me as if that answer had settled something. Then the next slide appeared. Hawthorne's principal was Mark Ellison. I recognized the name only after Cole reacted. They had been fraternity brothers. Cole sat back. We knew each other in college. That doesn't mean anything. Was the relationship disclosed when Hawthorne was approved as a vendor? The accountant asked. It wasn't material. She displayed Whitmore's conflict policy. It required disclosure of personal relationships that could create an actual or perceived conflict. Cole's attorney began taking notes. The review then moved to Patricia. She had approved 4 exceptions to competitive bidding for Hawthorne. Accounts payable had warned that supporting vendor documentation was incomplete. Teresa Morales, the supervisor who raised those concerns, had later been reassigned. Patricia's attorney interrupted. Bid exceptions and staffing decisions fall within executive discretion. They can, the accountant said. Then she displayed an email Patricia had sent Cole. Your grandmother is looking too closely at Hawthorne. Clean up the descriptions before next month's review. The room went silent. Patricia stared at the screen. That meant improve the paperwork. The accountant did not argue. We are not characterizing that sentence as fraud. We are documenting what was written, when it was written, and what occurred afterward. That restraint made me trust the presentation more. Nobody was trying to turn suspicion into certainty. Then they moved to Dad. 11 question transactions carried David Bennett's approval credentials. 7 had originated from the workstation Patricia regularly used while Dad was traveling, absent, or logged out. 4 came from Dad's own workstation. Counsel asked him directly, "Did Patricia know your password?" Dad looked down. Yes. Was credential sharing permitted under company policy? No. For the 4 transactions you personally approved, did you review the supporting documents? No. Why? Patricia said they were urgent. Did you understand that your approval represented financial review? Dad swallowed. Yes. He had not admitted stealing anything. He had admitted something quieter. He had allowed convenience, trust, and avoidance to replace the responsibility attached to his own name. Finally, the accountants reached the question everyone had been waiting for. Had Hawthorne money gone to Cole? The answer was not what I expected. At this time, we cannot establish that Mr. Bennett personally received Hawthorne funds. Cole's posture changed immediately. Confidence returned to his face. So you still can't show I took $1? Nobody answered. For the first time, I wondered whether he might be right. Maybe Cole was arrogant. Maybe Patricia had bypassed controls. Maybe Dad had been careless. But none of that automatically meant Cole had taken money. The board recessed. When the directors returned, their actions were temporary. Cole was placed on paid administrative leave while the review continued. His procurement and expense approval permissions were suspended. Patricia remained involved in transition, but an interim outside finance officer would oversee significant payments. Dad was removed from approval functions pending further review. Nobody was fired. Nobody was declared guilty. In the parking lot, Cole caught up with me. You still have nothing. He walked away smiling. That night, for the first time, I seriously wondered whether Grandma had been wrong. The next morning, counsel called. Hannah, Hawthorne's owner reached out. Why? He wants to cooperate. 3 days after Hawthorne's owner agreed to cooperate, I asked Teresa Morales if she would meet me for coffee. She chose a small diner 10 minutes from Whitmore's warehouse. Teresa had worked for the company 16 years. Until recently, she had supervised accounts payable. Now she handled billing support, a quieter job with less authority and fewer reasons for executives to notice her. I asked about the warnings she had sent regarding Hawthorne. She told me she had noticed missing documentation, repeated invoice descriptions, and bid exceptions that did not match the files she was seeing. So why did you stop pushing? I asked. The question sounded harsher once it was in the air. Teresa stirred her coffee. Because I had a mortgage. I said nothing. My husband had surgery that year. I carried our health insurance. My youngest was still in college. She looked at me. I could ask a question. I could ask twice. But after Patricia reassigned me, I understood the message. I had spent most of my career believing that when something looked wrong, the responsible thing was simple. You spoke up. Teresa made me understand how incomplete that idea was. Speaking was easier when you had savings, or another job waiting, or ownership, or a lawyer, or enough power that asking a question would not decide whether your family kept its house for the first time. I saw the different kinds of silence around me. Mine had come from wanting to be loved without becoming difficult. Dad's had come from wanting to avoid conflict. Teresa's had come from needing a paycheck. They were not morally identical. The more power someone had, the less innocent silence became. What stayed with me was not that Teresa had been afraid. It was that the system had taught her fear was practical. She had responsibilities, while the people dismissing her questions had authority without comparable risk. Later that afternoon, Jason Miller, one of Cole's senior account managers, stopped me near the break room. I know everybody expects me to hate him now, he said. I don't. I waited. Cole fought for my commission 2 years ago when finance wanted to cut it. He's helped people here. I believe you. Jason looked surprised. You do? Both things can be true. Cole could have been generous to Jason and still violated company rules. People did not become simpler because an investigation started. That evening, my Aunt Linda called. Whatever happened, she said. You don't do this to your brother. I almost laughed. Do what? Humiliate him. Put his job at risk. Who told you about the investigation? Silence. The board process was confidential. I understood immediately. Cole was telling relatives his version before the facts could speak for themselves. The next morning, my cousin Megan sent me screenshots from an old family group chat. 2 years earlier, Mom had written, Mom is getting paranoid about expenses again. Hannah feeds it because she likes feeling important. Cole replied, Keep clipboard Hannah away from finance. I read the line twice. It should have embarrassed me. Instead, it clarified something. They had not merely failed to notice my strengths. Whenever those strengths threatened the role they preferred for me, they mocked them until I retreated. I opened social media. For 15 angry minutes, I built a post. The screenshots, Mom's Hawthorne email, a summary of the audit findings. I imagined tagging every relative who had called me difficult, jealous, or disloyal. I imagined Mom's friends reading it, Cole's clients, the people who had always believed his confidence meant competence. My thumb hovered over post. Then I remembered Grandma's note. Anger is not an accounting method. Do not punish them. Make hiding impossible. I sat there for a long time. Then I deleted the draft. I forwarded the screenshots to counsel because they referenced company records and the investigation, nothing else. I wish I could say restraint felt noble. It didn't. It felt like giving up a weapon I knew would work. But this time, silence was not something my family demanded from me. It was a choice I made because I finally understood the difference between exposing the truth and using the truth to hurt someone. I wanted accountability. That would have to be enough. 3 days later, Mom called before coming over. That detail was small enough to miss, but I noticed it immediately. A month earlier, she had used an emergency key and let herself into my apartment because she believed being my mother was permission enough. This time she asked if Dad and she could stop by after dinner. I said yes. When they arrived, Mom kept her coat on. Dad sat at the edge of the sofa, hands clasped between his knees. Patricia did not waste time. You need to end this. I can't. You control the trust. I control the voting rights that protect the review. Same difference. No, she exhaled sharply. The company is losing clients. I had read the board update that morning. One account delayed renewal because its procurement cycle changed. Another asked for reassurance about management stability. Neither has canceled. Mom insisted that clients rarely announced when they were preparing to leave. She said rumors could do damage before any cancellation appeared on a report. And for once, I did not dismiss the argument. She was right that uncertainty carried a cost. What I refused to accept was her conclusion that the safest response was to stop asking questions. Stability built on missing information was not stability. It was delay. And everyone in that room knew delay had protected Cole before too long. Mom stared at me. Do you enjoy correcting me? I enjoy knowing what's true. She turned to Dad. Say something. For most of my life, that sentence had meant the same thing. Tell Hannah not to make this worse. Tell her family matters more. Tell her to understand. Dad looked at Mom, then at me. She's right. The room changed. Patricia blinked. David. No. His voice was quiet, but he did not take the word back. She's right about the accounts. Mom stood. So, and now you're taking her side? Dad rubbed his palms together. I'm trying to stop pretending there are sides when there are records. I had never heard him talk to her that way. He looked at me. I knew your mother used my login sometimes. Patricia opened her mouth. He kept going. I knew it violated policy. I told myself it was faster. I also approved transactions I didn't review because Patricia said they were urgent. His eyes dropped. And I knew how things were with you and Cole. That hurt more than the financial confession. I saw it, he said. I told myself staying quiet kept the family together. He swallowed. It didn't. It just meant I wasn't the one paying for the peace. For years, I had imagined hearing my father admit that. I had expected relief. What I felt was grief. I'm sorry I didn't speak, he said. Mom was obvious, I answered. Neither of them moved. Cole was obvious. My throat tightened. But you were the parent I kept waiting for. Dad's face folded. Every time she did it, I looked at you. He closed his eyes. And every time, you looked somewhere else. I know. No, you know now. He nodded. I did not forgive him. Not because I wanted to punish him. Because an apology could acknowledge 20 years without repairing them in one evening. Mom crossed her arms. So now I'm the villain? Dad looked at her. You make accountability sound like an attack. Her face went pale. She grabbed her purse. At the door. She looked at me as though waiting for me to stop her. I didn't. She left alone. 2 days later, Dad signed the board's corrective findings. He resigned as controller and agreed to remain in a limited advisory role during transition before retiring. Mom began separate negotiations with company counsel. The findings did not accuse her of stealing money because the evidence did not support that conclusion. They focused on control overrides, failures of disclosure, and interference with scrutiny. That distinction mattered. Accuracy had to matter even when anger wanted something simpler. Then, just as the family conflict seemed to have reached its worst point, Nathan called. Hannah, the Hawthorne records came in. I went to his office. The forensic accountant placed a new entity chart on the table. One name sat beneath Hawthorne Strategic Events, CB Ridge Consulting, LLC. I stared at the initials, C.B. Cole Bennett. The first thing the forensic accountant said was that Hawthorne was not entirely fake. That mattered. Some invoices matched real subcontractors. Some event work had actually been performed. Several client development services could be documented. Other charges remained disputed because the supporting records were incomplete, inconsistent, or too vague to verify. Then she turned to the part that had brought us back into the conference room. Whitmore paid Hawthorne. Hawthorne paid legitimate vendors. And over time, Hawthorne also paid CB Ridge Consulting, LLC. The total traced to CB Ridge was approximately $82,600. The company had never appeared on a related party disclosure form. Its mailing address was a private mailbox near Cole's condo. Banking and ownership records obtained through the company's civil process linked the entity to Cole Bennett. Nobody spoke. The accountant did not call every Hawthorne invoice fraudulent. She did not claim that every dollar paid to CB Ridge was necessarily stolen. She said something narrower and more difficult to dismiss. Based on the records available, CB Ridge received undisclosed related party payments connected to business awarded through Hawthorne. Those payments represent a personal or affiliated benefit that was not disclosed to Whitmore. Cole's attorney immediately asked whether every payment could be tied to a specific false invoice. "No," the accountant said. "Then you cannot say my client stole $82,600. "I did not say that." That answer changed the tone of the room. That distinction mattered because an investigation could become dishonest in the opposite direction. Once people wanted Cole guilty, every unexplained dollar could start looking identical. Grandma had insisted on separating suspicion from proof, and the accountants were doing exactly that. This was not about finding the most dramatic label. It was about identifying what the records actually supported. Mom had been staring at Cole since the ownership link appeared. "You told me Hawthorne was clean." Cole looked irritated rather than frightened. "It was consulting. You told me there was nothing to disclose. There wasn't anything improper about the work." "That isn't what I asked." For the first time, Patricia did not look like Cole's defender. She looked like someone realizing that the person she had protected had controlled how much truth she was allowed to see. "You knew I was taking heat for Hawthorne," she said. Cole leaned back. "Mom, don't do this here." "You told me there was nothing." He did not answer. Watching her face, I understood something uncomfortable. Mom had overridden controls for him. She had minimized warnings. She had reassigned Teresa. She had helped create the conditions that allowed questions to disappear. But CB Ridge shocked her. She had protected Cole without knowing how far he had gone. That did not erase her responsibility. It made it different from his. The board's counsel summarized the distinctions carefully. Cole faced potential claims involving undisclosed related party, self-dealing, and personal benefit. Patricia faced findings involving control overrides, concealment of concerns, failure to investigate a known conflict, and the retaliatory reassignment of an employee who had raised questions. Dad's conduct remained serious governance negligence. 3 people had helped the same broken system survive. They had not done the same thing. Cole's attorney requested a recess. When they returned, he challenged the governance trust itself. He argued that Grandma had overreacted, that the trust interfered with ordinary corporate management, and that Cole was prepared to consider litigation. Cole finally looked at me. "You wanted a war? Fine." Nathan did not threaten him. He did not say Cole would lose. "Then we'll respond through the proper process." Cole's attorney went quiet. Nathan continued. "If a petition is filed, the parties will proceed through discovery, document production, depositions, and whatever additional examination the court permits." I watched Cole's expression change. Litigation sounded powerful when it was just a threat. Discovery sounded different. It meant more records, more emails, more accounts. More questions answered somewhere that family was not an objection. The meeting ended without resolution. Cole left before Mom. She stayed seated for almost a minute, staring at the blank screen where CB Ridge had been displayed. I wondered whether she was finally angry at him, or at herself. 2 days later, Nathan called me. Hawthorne's owner has agreed to continue cooperating with company counsel. What does that mean? It means Cole's attorney called this morning. I waited. Nathan's voice remained calm. They want to discuss settlement. For the first time in my life, my brother was not calling the room to order. He was asking for a negotiation. The settlement took almost 6 weeks to finalize. There was no courtroom scene, no police escort, and no public confession. Cole agreed to repay $82,600 to Whitmore Exhibit and Fabrication. Part came from his personal funds. The remainder came, by written agreement, from a portion of his estate distribution that had already been held in reserve while the company's claims were being reviewed. He resigned from Whitmore. He waived any future management claim connected to Grandma's shares and agreed not to present himself publicly as a representative of the company. That was it. No dramatic collapse. No prison sentence. No family press conference. Just a signed agreement that finally placed the cost of Cole's choices on Cole. For the first time, consequences were not assigned to whoever was easiest to disappoint. Nobody asked me to absorb damage, so Cole could keep his reputation, Mom keep her authority, or Dad keep calling avoidance peace. The cost stayed with the choices that created it. Patricia's settlement looked different because her conduct had been different. The review found no evidence that she had personally received money from Hawthorne or CB Ridge. She was not labeled a thief, and I refused to let anyone use a stronger word simply because it felt satisfying. What the records did support was serious enough. She had overridden controls, minimized conflicts, ignored warnings, reassigned Teresa after she raised concerns, and protected Cole from scrutiny long after she had reason to ask harder questions. Mom resigned as CFO, completed a transition to an outside finance officer, cooperated with the remaining review, and waived her challenge to the governance trust. Her consequence was not poverty. It was loss of control. For a woman who had spent years deciding who belonged in rooms and whose questions mattered. That was not a small thing. Dad had already resigned as controller. He stayed briefly in an advisory role to help transfer records and systems, then retired. He stopped describing what happened as something Patricia had caused. When the board discussed his failures, he used a sentence I had never heard from him before. I signed it. I own that. That mattered more to me than any apology he could have repeated. Whitmore did not collapse after Cole left. 2 account managers divided his client portfolio. An outside CFO was hired. The board required dual approval for significant payments, formal disclosure of related party relationships, independent review of high-risk vendors, and a stronger anonymous reporting process. Some clients asked questions. A few projects slowed. One account left for reasons that had nothing to do with the investigation. 6 months later, operating margin had improved modestly. Not because Cole had secretly ruined everything, because fewer undocumented expenses were being approved. Rush discounts received more scrutiny, and people were finally required to explain exceptions instead of attaching a familiar name to them. The company did not need a hero. It needed controls that worked when the wrong person was having a good quarter. Teresa was offered her old accounts payable supervisor position. She accepted. When one director suggested a larger management role, she shook her head. "I don't need a bigger title." "What do you need?" he asked. "A place where the next person can ask a question without wondering whether it costs them their mortgage." The board later created an employee advisory seat on the governance committee. That was when I finally understood what Grandma had actually given me. Not status, not revenge, not a chance to prove that I had secretly been more important than Cole all along. She had given me enough authority to keep the door open while people with less power told the truth. Teresa had risked her paycheck. Employees had risked their standing. Independent directors had risked conflict with a family that controlled most of the company. My job was not to become the strongest person in the room. It was to help make strength less necessary. A month after the settlement, Cole sent me a message. Hope destroying the family was worth it. I read it twice. There were 100 things I could have written. Instead, I typed one sentence. I didn't create the transactions. Cole, he never replied. A year after Grandma died, my life looked surprisingly ordinary. I still worked in compliance. I still reviewed supplier files, deviation reports, and release records. I had not become CEO of Whitmore, and I had not become rich enough to make anybody regret underestimating me. The changes were smaller. They were changes nobody photographs because they happen in ordinary moments when nobody is standing there applauding you. When I needed a day off, I asked. When a coworker offered help, I sometimes accepted it. When someone crossed a boundary, I stopped apologizing for correcting them. And when people asked how I was doing, I tried not to say, "I'm fine," unless I actually meant it. Mom and I never had the perfect reconciliation people expect at the end of family stories. Sometimes Patricia texted me on my birthday. "Happy birthday," I answered. "Thank you." No hostility. No pretending we were close again. I eventually understood that forgiveness and access were not the same thing. I could stop carrying anger without reopening every door. Dad and I met for coffee about once a month. He did not become a different man overnight, but he stopped asking me to manage Mom's feelings for her. He no longer said, "She's having a hard time," as if her pain automatically became my responsibility. One November afternoon, he asked, "Are you coming for Thanksgiving?" "Who'll be there?" He listed the names. Mom would be there. Cole would not. I looked down at my coffee. "I'll let you know, a year earlier. Dad would have pushed. Your mother needs you there. Don't make this harder. Family should be together." Instead, he nodded. "Okay." One word, no guilt, no persuasion, no request that I turn uncertainty into yes just to make somebody else comfortable. That was the moment I understood his apology more than I had understood any speech. A week later, Nathan called. Grandma had left one final letter to be given to me after the first year of the governance review. I went back to the same office where Mom had once tried to leave me in the hallway. Nathan handed me a single page. Eleanor wrote that she had spent too many years confusing peace with the absence of confrontation. She had stayed silent because silence felt civilized. But peace purchased with the silence of the injured person, she wrote, was not peace at all. It only transferred the cost of conflict to the person least allowed to object. Then came the line that stayed with me. Do not confuse being needed with being loved. And do not confuse being family with having unlimited access to your life. I sat there thinking about doors, the conference room door, my Thanksgiving chair, the emergency key, Dad's password, Cole's system permissions, Grandma's voting authority. Every one of them had really been about the same question. Who gets access and who gets to decide? At the beginning of the year, Nathan had needed to say, "She stays." I had needed someone else to confirm that I belonged in the room. I did not need that anymore. Belonging was not permission. My family could grant or withdraw. I had not destroyed them. I had simply stopped being the person expected to absorb the consequences so everyone else could keep calling the family peaceful. Sometimes healing begins when it's fine, stops being the price of being loved. So tell me this, who failed Hannah most? The mother who favored one child, the brother who learned to exploit that favoritism, or the father who saw it and stayed silent? And if someone only calls you family when they need access to something you have, would you give them another chance or protect the boundary you finally built? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about family, truth, boundaries, accountability, and people learning to reclaim their dignity without becoming cruel, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next story.